So, let's dive deeper into this fictional scenario, one that imagines a political earthquake unlike anything the modern world has seen. Again, just to be crystal clear before we go forward, this is a hypothetical, what-if, scenario. Not real, not predictive, not a news report. This is storytelling mixed with political analysis, the kind viewers love because it forces them to think about how fragile global systems really are. Now let's expand the timeline. In this imagined world, the tension between the United States and its closest allies didn't erupt overnight. It grew slowly, like a crack spreading through the foundation of a building, small at first, then suddenly impossible to ignore. Behind the scenes, diplomats across Europe, Canada, and Australia were becoming increasingly uneasy about what they described as institutional volatility in Washington. Private meetings became more frequent. Reports from intelligence agencies became more urgent. Concerns once whispered in hallways were now being discussed openly in high-level briefings. In London, according to this fictional timeline, advisors to the Prime Minister discussed scenarios previously considered unthinkable. What happens if America's internal turmoil spills across borders? What happens if corruption inside its leadership compromises shared intelligence? What if the balance of global power begins to tilt? A similar conversation echoes inside Brussels. European Commission officials note that the stability of the transatlantic relationship, long the backbone of Western security, feels increasingly fragile. They begin drafting contingency plans, quietly, cautiously, almost reluctantly. By midsummer in this fictional universe, the four capitals, Brussels, London, Ottawa, and Canberra, begin coordinating discrete weekly video conferences. Legal teams compare frameworks. Intelligence chiefs exchange assessments. Economists outline potential ripple effects. Each week, the warnings grow louder. Each week, the scenarios look more dangerous. And each week, the possibility of coordinated action becomes less theoretical and more necessary. Now, imagine the moment everything reaches critical mass. At precisely 6 a.m. Eastern Time, simultaneously across 4 continents, the joint announcement is released. A multinational anti-corruption response targeting specific American officials and entities. Markets freeze. Newsrooms scramble. Social media detonates. But here's the twist. The statement doesn't condemn the United States as a nation. It doesn't frame Americans as the problem. It focuses solely on individuals whose actions, in this imaginary world, allegedly threaten global stability. And in diplomatic language, which is normally painfully polite, the wording is shockingly direct. They cite documented governance concerns, dangerous erosion of democratic norms, and risks to allied national security. These are not small accusations. These are words nations typically reserve for hostile regimes, not longtime partners. The shockwaves are immediate. In New York, traders react before the opening bell. Treasury yields swing wildly. Investors rush to gold and European bonds. Analysts struggle to assess what it means for the US dollar, the world's reserve currency. Political pundits flood the airwaves, each offering a theory more dramatic than the one before. Some argue the Allies have overstepped. Others say they had no choice. Everyone agrees the situation is unprecedented. Inside Washington, fictional chaos erupts. The Situation Room fills in minutes. Phones ring non-stop. Cabinet members demand answers. Lawyers debate international authority versus domestic sovereignty. Some officials push for immediate retaliation, tariffs, diplomatic expulsions, maybe even cutting intelligence ties. Others warn such actions could escalate the crisis beyond repair. The biggest question becomes, what happens if America's closest allies no longer trust its leadership? Because, in this scenario, trust is the currency that binds alliances together. And trust, once shaken, is nearly impossible to restore. Across the Atlantic, a different kind of panic unfolds. European leaders fear that this hypothetical action, while necessary in their eyes, may permanently damage the Western alliance. Military officials ask whether US cooperation in NATO will continue. Intelligence agencies ask whether joint operations now risk exposure. Foreign ministers debate how to communicate to their citizens that this response targets individuals, not the American people themselves. In Ottawa, advisors to the Canadian Prime Minister express deep worry that Russia and China will exploit the rift. The concern isn't theoretical. When alliances fracture, opportunistic powers move fast. Meanwhile, the fictional Australian cabinet holds an emergency meeting, asking whether regional Pacific security can withstand a weakened US-led coalition. China's influence looms large. But let's zoom back to Washington. The administration's initial reaction, in this scenario, is anger. A statement is drafted condemning the measures as an attack on sovereignty. But as markets continue crashing and prominent senators express outrage at the global embarrassment, the messaging becomes more desperate and inconsistent. One minute, officials threaten retaliation. The next minute, they suggest diplomacy might be possible. Then, hours later, they float the idea of withdrawing troops from Europe, only to walk it back the next day. This fictional inconsistency sends the crisis spiraling further. Allies look at Washington and ask, if the leadership cannot respond coherently, how can we rely on the United States in a crisis? This opens the door to a frightening possibility, the multipolar world order accelerating faster than anyone predicted. In think tanks across Europe and Asia, analysts begin running simulations. What if NATO becomes paralyzed? What if joint military exercises halt? What if financial institutions decouple from US partners? What if smaller nations start aligning with China simply out of strategic necessity? In this imagined scenario, even corporations are thrown into turmoil. Banks with Trump-connected accounts, or accounts tied to the sanctioned officials, suddenly find themselves violating international rules if they continue operations. Some freeze assets voluntarily just to avoid legal risk. Real estate projects stall. Foreign investors retreat. Economists warn that, hypothetically, this level of instability could trigger a recession if prolonged. The global economy is interconnected. When the central pillar shakes, every nation feels it. Now, the real pressure hits Congress. For months, according to this fictional world, they avoided taking a hard stance. But now, with allies acting before they do, lawmakers from both parties face impossible questions. Do they investigate the administration to restore global trust? Or do they close ranks and accuse allies of overreach? Neither option is politically safe. Both divide the nation even further. Both have consequences that could reshape foreign policy for decades. Then, a moment that defines the crisis occurs. A fictional statement from a senior European official leaks. We acted because we believed American institutions would eventually respond internally. But after years of waiting, it became clear they would not. Even fictional, the quote is chilling. It implies that allied governments, in this alternate timeline, believe the United States is no longer capable of policing corruption within its own leadership. If true in this scenario, that would represent the single greatest loss of confidence in American governance since 1776. And as this imaginary crisis unfolds, the reaction from adversarial nations becomes louder. Russian and Chinese media frame it as proof of Western collapse. Diplomats from those countries quietly court European and Middle Eastern partners, offering alternative security agreements. The global chessboard begins to move. This is where the fictional scenario hits its peak. The United States must decide between two catastrophic options. Option 1. Escalate. Withdraw from NATO, impose counter-sanctions, retaliate economically, isolate diplomatically. But this would fracture the Western world, giving authoritarian powers unprecedented leverage. Option 2. De-escalate. Negotiate with allies, acknowledge concerns, allow investigations. But this would anger the president's political base, be seen as humiliating, and possibly weaken domestic authority. There is no good path. Only damage control. The allies, meanwhile, must choose their own path. Do they double down on sanctions? Do they seek negotiations? Or do they begin planning a world order where the United States is no longer the unquestioned leader? The scenario ends not with resolution, but with uncertainty. Because the message behind this fictional crisis is simple. Democracy is only as strong as the institutions that protect it. Alliances last only as long as trust remains. And when corruption, real or perceived, undermines that trust, the entire world feels the consequences. This story isn't predicting the future. It's illustrating how fragile the global order truly is, and how quickly the unimaginable can become reality if democratic systems are not safeguarded. So keep watching, keep questioning, and remember, stability isn't guaranteed. It's something nations must earn every single day.